Behind me, off in the distance, is the Sewall House, the original home of one of Martin County's early residents. Join me now as we walk to the house to get a closer look at an important part of our heritage. Captain Henry Sewall originally built this house, which now has a permanent home here at Indian Riverside Park. Originally located next to the water, beside the bluff, on the southeast tip of Sewall's Point, well over a century ago in 1891. He and his wife Abby made it their home and established it as the Sewall's Point Post Office the same year. The home and post office sat at the beginning of a long freight dock. At the end of the dock was a picturesque building that provided shelter and a place to store freight. Rufus King Sewall, Captain Sewall's father, was a congregational minister in Maine. In the early 1840s, he visited St. Augustine to recover from what was diagnosed as a weakness of the lungs. There he met and married a widow, Anna Hanson. Her late husband, John, had died in a shipwreck. John Hanson owned 1/3 of the Miles Hanson Grant, and the land that included today's Sewall's Point was inherited by Anna. The couple returned to Maine, but in 1845, the Sewalls came back to St. Augustine to be closer to Mrs. Sewall's land. Captain Henry Sewall was born in St. Augustine in 1848. The Sewall family, now with 5 children, was forced to move back to Maine. Young Henry eventually entered the Merchant Marine Service. He sailed around the world several times, and in 1868, was one of only 4 who survived a shipwreck near Cape Hatteras. In 1873, he married Abby Thomas, and within 3 years left the sea and established a coal business in New York City. Henry Sewall first came to the area in 1886, when he visited Eden Grove, a small hotel just north of today's Sewall's Point. He arrived for good in what would come to be called Sewall's Point 3 years later, in 1889. At the time, the St. Lucie River flowed north, where it entered the ocean through the Indian River Inlet, 3 miles north of Fort Pierce. Captain Sewall came down the Indian River, and 27 years later, in a Stuart News article in 1916, described what he experienced on that trip.
Well, the river was very, very grassy back then. They spoke of it as the meadows and sometimes called it the hayfield, for the grass was growing as far north as Ancona. It grew 600 feet out from the shore, and it was mighty hard to get through. The long, flat-bladed grass lay 6 feet or even longer on top of the water, but it was full of iodine, mosquitoes, and snakes. Now, the first thing that I did was to clear the land. I set out pines. I built a wharf and opened a post office. At the end of the dock, I made a station for the delivery and the freight that arrived and departed for the St. Lucie River. Now, the regular line of the Indian River boats ran to Jupiter and carried both freight, mail, and passengers, both north and south.
Captain Sewall knew that constructing good roads would encourage the development of Florida. He personally supervised the construction of one of the first in what would become Martin County. It ran from his home north along the Indian River to a little beyond where the bridges to Hutchinson Island are today.
In 1899, the Tropical Sun, a small local newspaper published in Juneau, described it as one of the best roads in the state. 15 feet wide, with every root removed. The soil is firm and of dark color, hence the sun doesn't glare in one's eyes as it does on a road made of rocks and shells, therefore making it more comfortable for both man and beast.
In 1893, Captain Sewall was named a commissioner of Dade County, which included Stuart and Sewall's Point. It was during a 10-year period of time when Juneau, not Miami, was the Dade County seat. Just a year later, in 1894, Captain Sewall was elected to the state legislature from Dade County. He would serve for 2 years. Although that was an important breakthrough for the people of Stuart and Martin County, The next year, 1895, brought a new recreational breakthrough. It was then that Gilbert's Bar Yacht Club was founded. The idea was born during a gathering at the estate of Charles and Mary Racy. Their 3-story wooden home stood on Mount Elizabeth, where the Tuckahoe Mansion stands today. Captain Sewall was elected Commodore and remained Commodore for almost 30 years. Eventually, a clubhouse was built on Hutchison Island and was a picnicking area and yachting destination for years to come. In the early 1900s, Captain Sewall was able to finally clear the title on the Hanson Grant land, and in 1910, he sold a parcel of land to a newcomer to Sewall's Point, Hugh Willoughby. The two men partnered to form the Sewall's Point Land Company. Shortly after the company was formed, Captain and Mrs. Sewall built a new home high on a bluff overlooking the St. Lucie Inlet. Captain Sewall, his sister Elizabeth's husband James Rogers, and Hugh Willoughby platted the town of Port Sewall in 1911. When the Sewalls built their new home, Captain Sewall's nephew, Maxwell Smith, moved this home by barge to one of the newly platted lots in Port Sewall. On its new site, an interior staircase, fireplace, and chimney were added. It was modernized with conveniences like plumbing and a bathroom. Captain Sewall lived another 14 years. He died on August 1, 1925, 4 days before Martin County officially became a Florida county. His original home would remain in Port Sewall for almost 90 years and was home to a variety of owners and renters. One of the renters, Ozzie Hopkins, was a wholesale bootlegger and local legend. During World War II, the old Sewall house was rented to Lieutenant Robert Holtzman, who was assigned to Witham Field. Bus and Sandra Schock bought the Sewall house. Although they enlarged the house, they barely altered the old section because they valued the history. The Schocks hosted the Stuart Heritage Tours and shared the history of their house whenever it was possible. 2 more owners followed the Schocks. The last owner, Joe Lenner, wanted to build a larger, modern home. He was granted a permit to demolish the house, but he too valued the history of the house and told a neighbor, Jim Dragseth, he would donate the house if it could be preserved. The late Fred Ayers, who owned the Dolphin Bar and Conky Joe's restaurants, gave $50,000 to the Historical Society of Martin County toward the preservation of the house. With this example, the Martin County Commission voted unanimously to fund its preservation, and Commissioner Doug Smith worked to incorporate the historical structure into Indian Riverside Park. It took several years to have the architectural plans complete and the site here prepared for Captain Henry Sewall's home. Moving it again by barge was an event covered by all the local news media. Now, as you approach the house from the Mangrove Boardwalk, it looks very much as it did when it was next to Captain Sewall's long freight dock. It seems appropriate that the house have a permanent home here at Indian Riverside Park. The site is only 200 yards from where Gilbert's Bar Yacht Club was formed and Captain Sewall elected Commodore. It's also a short distance from Captain Sewall's grave in All Saints Cemetery in Jensen Beach. This house has stood since 1891. It has weathered hurricanes and survived being moved on the river by barge. It has seen bootleggers and wars. Now it gives a new generation a look at and a feel for the past that is part of the community in which we live.